Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast, where we talk about making disciples, doing justice, and sharing Jesus to accelerate evangelism. Because when the people of God do the work of God, it transforms lives in our communities. Today, I've got a special guest with us. Bruce Boria is the senior pastor at Bethany Church, a multi-site church in the seacoast area of New Hampshire and southern Maine. And Bruce, thanks for being with us.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks. And Bruce is also a Vision New England board member, just to disclose that. But Bruce, before we get started, can you share a little bit about your story, a little bit about growing up, where, when, getting saved, call to ministry, and to New England in particular?
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, so my accent isn't typically New Hampshire, but the attitude is definitely from New York. And I grew up in a blended family. It was yours, mine's, and ours, and I was part of the ours. My dad was a career Marine. He's still in the Marines, right? They say once a Marine, always a Marine.
Same thing with my dad. Never call him he used to be a Marine, right?
Right. So, in fact, we have 107 years in the Marine Corps.
Wow.
Between my dad and I have 5 brothers. I have 4 sons, one who passed during COVID. And I have 2 grandsons, so we can't buy a girl in this family. But I tell my boys one of them is going to give me a little granddaughter here. But I pastored in New York, went to seminary in Philly, and then got a doctorate at Gordon Conwell, but in the Charlotte campus when they opened up a Charlotte campus. And then I was from New York. I moved out to Oregon. Pastored there for 10 years, and then now I've been at Bethany almost 20.
Wow. And you're reminding me of good friends of ours who they kept having boys till they finally had a girl, and then they were done. So you guys just stopped too early, Bruce. That was the mistake.
Well, no, you know what? I had 3, and then 7 years later we had the next one. Okay. So the joke around the house was I had eeny, meeny, miny, and no mo. And then I wound up getting 1 mo. So
had to fill it out, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about Bethany. Kind of what's its background? How did you wind up there? What are you seeing God do there?
Well, Bethany has been around for a very long time. It was started in 1727, and we have a couple of original members still there. They're a little putrefied, but other than that, they're good. But seriously, it's been around for a very long time. Has gone like most churches in its ups and downs. When I came, they had purchased some new property. They built a whole new expansion, and it was right around the time of 9/11. So I actually came in 03. So in 2003, I came. But one of the unique things about the church is they had a pastor, Schlafer, who in the 70s came very evangelical and turned this UCC church completely around and led the elders to the Lord, had a real good revival. And then after that, Pastor Schlafer's son would one day go on to be very high up with Promise Keepers.
Okay.
And so I met Dale because I did some speaking for Promise Keepers in a number of the cities. But so that was back in the 70s. So when I came, they already had withdrawn from the UCC, very evangelical, very mission focused, had new buildings. And one of the pilots that flew into the World Trade Center, a man by the name of Tom McGinnis and his wife, Cheryl. Well, Tom was fatally one of those lost in 9/11. And because they were from the church, it really put the church on the map because they had a service for many of the American airline pilots at Bethany. And so it's been around for a long time. And now we're in a number of different locations, just trying to stay this tide of churches that are just closing their doors. I still think the promise that God gave to Joshua is still valid. Like, well, let's go out there and every foot that we tread, we'll ask him for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Bruce, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about is disciple making, because I know that's very close to your heart, and I know you've invested a lot of time in that. But to just set the table for that, Jesus gave us the Great Commission, right? Go and make disciples. I know some of our backgrounds think of that more as a missional verse as opposed to a disciple making verse. It has a little bit of both in it. But how is the church doing at that making of disciples?
Well, it's always it's an easy question in the sense to answer that. I don't think there's any doubt what God has called us to. I mean, there are multiple places in the scriptures that we are being commanded to go out. Let your light shine before men that they may see your good work and glorify your Father who's in heaven, right? And the idea of going out and making disciples is then qualified by this idea of, going, baptizing, teaching. So the participles in that text are always just enhancing what it means to make a disciple. Can't do that at home, right? You got to go out to all people. And you have to bring them into a relationship that they identify with this God who has revealed himself as Father, Son, Spirit. And then you got to teach them to obey. So how do you teach somebody to obey? I think of the difference there is we're not here just to teach people information. But the text says you are to teach them to obey, which means then, like, I'm always, I hold in high esteem some of these, tradespeople. They have such skill. They come into your house. They're able to do like phenomenal work, right? So I'm always trying to learn from them, and they're very practical about it. They're saying, "Hey, you need this tool. You need to do it this way. Follow these procedures." And man, I finished my whole basement from a guy that just came over and gave me some drawings. Came over, gave me a couple of hands, inspected my work. It took me a long time, but man, I learned a bunch from that guy. How to wire, how to hang, ceiling. There was a guy in my church who was a drywall person for years and years. Gave me a lesson. It didn't go really great the first couple of times, but by the time I got the end of it, I did all right.
Right. You learned how to drywall, then you learned how to rip it down and put it back up again and do it right.
Exactly. Yeah. The sanding part. He was like, "Yeah, you're sanding way too much, dude."
Yeah.
But that's the point, right? That you learn so you could have some practical applications here. Not to take over on a tangent, but this whole COVID experience, I think what it has done, it has uncovered the very weakness in a lot of our churches. There is a book by Will Mancini that was out called Future Church, and he had two funnels, right? So you had one funnel coming one funnel coming in, and then one funnel coming out, right? So he says this attractional funnel where you drew people in, it was all about about the personality of the leader. It's about the place, how nice it looks. It's about the programs. It's all of those things. While they're really important, we put all that emphasis in. We do all that to bring people in, and we think, okay, well, we did our job. Mm-hmm. When the job is just beginning, because you brought them in, now you got to grow them up. And man, that's hard. It's just like raising your kids. You try your best, but the kid has to do part of the work too. You can't do it all. And each kid is different. So you can see on a microcosm that takes place in your home and how you're trying to do the best for your children. But you talk to, like my oldest boy, I would have to get 2 inches from his face, man, to let him know that I was serious. The toughest guy in my household, if I just mentioned something, in a stern way, I could see that it really would bother him. Like he didn't like his dad, feeling that he had to get that exercised over something. And I just sat there and I realized, yeah, these guys are all different. I can't approach them the same way. And yet I am called to father them. So how am I going to do that? So it's the same thing in church. I think what COVID has done is it has underscored the weaknesses in our, because all we did was really concentrate on this attractional model, throwing in good sermons, some Bible studies, but it was always about the programming and not really paying attention to, are people really getting it? So when you have no personality, when you have no programs, when you have no place, then now what do you have?
Yeah.
And that's what happened. People are home, and their faith in Jesus, for many of them, man, it just wasn't strong enough. And the levels of anxiety just went higher and higher.
Yeah. And so I was just reading Peter Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Disciple Making, or Discipleship. And he was differentiating between believers and disciples as being two different things. Is that a fair dichotomy?
I would have to see what those definitions are. For me, a disciple, we say a disciple is someone who loves God and loves others by putting his truth into practice. So you could say you love God, but if you're not loving your neighbor, Jesus, it tells you in the book of Revelation, you're a liar. The truth is not in you. How can you love God whom you have not seen if you don't love your brother whom you have? And then if I'm loving my brother by becoming just like him, and in the sense that I am not bringing this redemptive word into this relationship, then do I really love my brother? It's like a parent giving their kid everything. Are you really loving your kid? Because you're crippling this kid.
Yeah.
So you recognize that loving God and loving neighbor has to be qualified by putting his truth into practice.
It's interesting you say that. I was teaching a Bible study this summer, a virtual Bible study for a church in Connecticut. And we got to a point where the same thing was like, so prove to me you love Bruce, right? And I use the example, prove to me you love your wife. And I'm like, well, I bought our house, right? I don't do that for anybody. Right? And now I'm joking about how I'm saying, and I put my kids through college, and every way I used to try and prove that I loved someone involved me sacrificing something or disadvantaging myself for them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we say we love people, but we can't always point to, so how did I sacrifice for them?
Right.
And I think that's what you're getting at when you're talking about, and how did you put his word into practice? Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah. And well, not putting your words in practice, putting his truth into practice.
Yeah.
So for instance, I know you well enough. I mean, you're a caring guy. You take the word seriously. You did that even in your secular work. It wasn't like you had the secular side and the spiritual side. They were all one for you. And you love your wife. But how many guys say, hey, look, I love you. I put the check on the table, don't I? And your wife is walking away feeling like, yeah, but I'm not feeling the love. Like, yeah, I mean, you're a good provider, but you're not, I don't feel the love here. And yet Jesus is saying, if you really love her, you're going to love her in the manner in which she needs to receive that love. Right. So you're loving your way, but if it's not crossing that chasm, you better go at it again, because it's not happening.
Yeah.
You need to love them the way they need to be loved.
Right.
You remember those 5 love languages, right? Like, we're all different.
Yeah.
And, like my wife's love language, she likes, acts of service. I mean, she'd much rather me go upstairs and clean the bathrooms than give her flowers. Like, to her, that's a value, she's a hard worker. She says, yeah, just help me out, man. And guaranteed that's going to put a smile on her face. She comes home and she sees, like, she's a nurse, right? She comes home and the house is like totally clean. She's like, I love you so much. It's a good weekend. Let me just put it that way.
Right. That's a really good point and a clarification. And you're reminding me, it's the love languages are not easy.
Right.
Right. Because my wife's just getting gifts. Right. And you don't have time to be cleaning your house. Right. You got other things to do. You got a task list. Right. And for my wife, it's gifts. Right. Which for me is the worst one, because I don't want to spend money on anything.
Yeah.
Right? And so it is, even tailoring to their love language is a sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because I'd like her love language to be, well, we watched TV last night. That's how you showed me you love me.
Right. Words of affirmation. How about that one?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I get you.
And so there's always sacrifice in the love. And so my hypothesis has been, what I've been noodling on for last year, is that I don't do those acts unless I'm not willing to sacrifice and disadvantage unless I'm a disciple, because it's only because Jesus tells me to do that I want to do it.
Right. Right.
Because I don't want to.
Yeah.
And so what's your approach to making disciples? You've been at this a long time. Help us learn from you.
Well, again, I just want to be clear that it's like, I go back to just raising your children. You have to take into account the dynamics that are taking place with each person. So it's not one size fits all, is what I'm saying. There are some.
So you didn't raise your children. You didn't raise your children by having a 12-week course that they went through.
No.
That was your program, right?
Right. Or some kids, think about it. Like my oldest boy, like the youngest guy, I can't ever remember having to tell him to finish his schoolwork. Like there was just something about him that he had this internal drive that he just could not relax unless he got it done. Right.
Yeah.
And the other guys, they you would see some of them struggling with, let's say, like math, where the other guy was like a whiz in math. So like they're all different, but there's still these values that we're trying to inculcate into their life. And so I think when it comes to discipleship, trying to pay attention to those gaps. Years ago, there was a book called Reveal that the Willow Creek Association had put out. And the woman that really headed up that project, she was a senior vice president for Allstate. Okay. And she hired a company to come in and come up with algorithms on risk factors for people, like what would make somebody more risk, less risk, and trying to get at lifestyle, and it was there were these surveys that they would give out, and she began to think, she was a Christian, and she said, I wonder if we could do that for believers. Like, what is it that is acting as catalyst for people in terms of their own growing? What seems to be really the most effective? And it was one of the most interesting kinds of projects, I remember that came out. Since then, they wrote another book called Move. Okay. And just to, because you're asking me like, wow, about this discipleship thing, it made me to realize that not everybody's the same. And as a church, you have to sit there and you have to begin to work those gaps. So, like, for instance, let me use my hand here for a moment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll use here. So here is a person he's the outlier. They're not even interested, really. They may troll your website. They may once in a while come because somebody invited them, but they're not really interested. They're just out here. Then you have this person over here who's curious. They have some questions about life. They may not necessarily be curious about Jesus, but they're at this place in their life that they have some questions that need to be answered. You have a person over here who now has become a believer. You have this guy over here who's being discipled. It's not just that Jesus is my savior. I want to know more about what that means. And then this person over here who is a mature believer who's realizing I got to give back. Right. Mm-hmm. So what I tell the guys, what we do at Bethany is say, all right, look at these gaps in here. So how do you get a person who's totally disinterested and at least make them curious?
Yeah.
How do you get the curious person to make a profession of faith? So that's this gap.
Yeah.
And then how do you get the person who's a believer to really get engaged in becoming more intentional about their discipleship? And then how do you get this person who's being discipled to be trained so that they can go out and make disciples? Mm-hmm. So if you concentrate on those gaps, now you try to use your creativity and say, okay, well, what are you going to do to make that happen?
Yeah. And so tell me then, when you talk about somebody being discipled, what do you mean by that?
Well, like I said, a disciple is someone who loves God and loves neighbor by putting his truth into practice. Mm-hmm. So now what I'm trying to do is find ways to help people to demonstrate their allegiance to God's will and God's way in ways in which they are growing both in their vertical dimension with God and in their horizontal relationship with people. Because Otherwise, it becomes a list of things that you have to do. And really, like I look at it like this: you plant apple seeds, right? What do you expect is going to happen? You think you're going to go back and you're going to find tomatoes, grapefruits? Like, no, it's an apple seed. You're going to produce apples, but it takes a little while for that apple seed to grow, for that tree to grow, right? But the most natural thing for that tree to do is to produce fruit. So if I am intentional about the way in which I am growing in my relationship with God and with people, the most natural thing is that the fruit of the Spirit that is now in me is going to be manifested in love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. Some people, they might say, oh, I need to be more loving. I have to be more joyful. Or I got to be a little bit more patient. And we go after the fruit, and God's saying, no, like the fruit springs forward from something that is already in you. Because like you see, like you're nodding your head, right? Because you get it. Like there are those moments in your life that all of a sudden you start doing something, and people, and your friends, your wife, your kids, they turn around, and they go, hey, Dad, man, I just want to let you know, like I've seen a change in you, man. Like you're not as uptight as you used to be. And you sit there and you go, yo, thanks for saying that, man. Because you walk away and you're thinking, now, did I intentionally do that? Or it's just that God has been doing a work in my life that now that fruit is being manifested. It's the same way you have desires in your heart. If they're contrary to the Spirit, they're going to manifest themselves in the acts of the flesh. Anger, malice, selfish ambition. Yeah, when you begin to see that fruit, you realize, I'm operating from the wrong system here.
I remember hearing one pastor say, we sometimes substitute behavior modification for making disciples.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Because yes, I'll stop doing these things, and now we all think I'm growing in my spiritual maturity, but in fact, I haven't dealt with any of the hard issues. I've just maintained some self-control around those things.
Yeah. You got dogs that do that.
Right. Yeah, right. And so Bruce, when you're saying you're getting me to focus more on that spiritual transformation, if we can call it that, is that something you're doing from the pulpit? Is that something that's happening in a small group? Is that happening with you and I in a diner on Saturday morning? What does that look like at Bethany?
Well, I think it's a holistic thing, right? Because a lot of times people think it's going to happen from the pulpit, but I think the best thing that I can do is model that with my life, right? And in the things that I say. So people are hearing you and they're seeing you. So that's a way. I also think that the pulpit could be used to drive change, because instead of speaking about 50 million things all the time, if these are the core values of who we are as a church, is that something that is being, repeated over and over and over again? And I think sometimes we have substituted the call to mission by just giving them biblical information, like a good story. Like you come to church, you're going to get like a nice Hallmark card. You're going to feel good. And I'm not discounting that, but I'm just saying, like, I don't see that Jesus did that. Like, yes, he was compassionate and kind and all those things, but he was also confrontational, and he didn't mince words sometimes. And he was definitely focused on the mission. I mean, so many times, right? Like, remember, he's telling them, I got to go to the cross. And Peter's saying, no, Lord, that'll never happen. He says, no, you got your mind on the things of God, on the things of man, not of God. Get behind me, Satan.
Yeah.
Or, when Jesus's mother is telling them, like, hey, he says, woman, it's not my time yet. Like, he definitely has a sense of focus. So I'm telling people in church, yeah, I want to bring that sense of urgency from the pulpit, but you better have some other things in the background that are also giving people their next step opportunities. So when I told you about, working these gaps, what I say to people, look, what do you have in the gaps? There's not like a secret sauce. You got to figure it out, but do something, you know? And so I went back and reading, you know, you realize that most people, when they're in that curious place, they want some answers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sat down and we said, okay, what would be foundational for people to give them enough answers about their questions that they could feel comfortable about making a decision? Because you and I both know, we've been at this for a long time. You can answer, like one time, you know, you talk to people, say, look, if I answered all your questions, would you become a believer? And they go, yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is still this inbred rebellion, like I'm in charge, you know. But there are some people, you give them enough information, and I mean, it's what's happened to me. Like there was a season of my life where I was really looking for answers. I was, you know, in my middle 20s.
Yeah.
I thought I had a great job. Things were going, and a couple of roadblocks come in, and it just left me, you know, like, whoa, what is all this about? And then my dad, who was this Marine Corps DI kind of guy, always in your face, you know, not in a bad way, but my dad was just aggressive. You know, he's that typical Marine guy. I mean, it took me a long time to realize you don't have conversations with people this close to their face.
You take orders at that level.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, yes, sir. You know, but I'm a lot like him. And so when he came to know Jesus, at first I didn't respond that well to that, because I'm like, who is this guy now?
Mm.
But it definitely, in that course of a year, it changed my heart. But where I'm going, this is, what are those things that are going to move somebody that's curious to making a profession? So at Bethany, we say there's 5 questions that deserve a good answer. Who is God? Who is Jesus? Why the cross? Why the Bible? Why am I here? And what we tried to do is answer those 5 questions in succinct ways, so that God is beyond us, God is in us, and God has manifested himself as Father, Son, and Spirit. Who is Jesus? Jesus is God, man, Lord, Savior. And then we unpack that, like, you know, just take people through like one text, like John 1, where you see that he was in the beginning, he was with God, was God, right? So he's eternal, he's personal, he's divine, but he comes flesh. And he is Lord over everything, because it says not one thing has been made that he hasn't made. And he has come to take away men's sin. So he is God, man, Lord, Savior. And if I give people handles like that, at least what I'm trying to do is answer some of those basic questions, so that they could feel a sense of confidence in this God that the Bible is, you know, revealing. So now they make a profession of faith. Mm-hmm. Well, what next? So if I'm a believer, I want to get these people on a road to being discipled. So how does that happen? Mm-hmm. Well, I think some of those things happen with some faith habits. You know, we called them spiritual disciplines, right? Mm-hmm. And I say, so why don't we teach people how to read their Bible? Most people, they open their Bibles, they have no clue. They think it's like a novel, and then they get disenchanted. Or, you know, there's vocabulary that is a little bit of an uphill climb for them, right? Talking about names and places, people that they don't even know about, cultural things. And I remind them all the time, I go, yeah, I just bought a new dishwasher, and I got the manual on how to put it in. I'm looking at it. I'm looking for the pictures, because the manual is like, it's like all over the map, right? Anything that you do, like cook and not follow the recipe, you know, or they'll say, you know, you need blanched flour, right? Or you just realize there's certain things that you got to learn. Mm-hmm. So why would your spiritual life be any different? So I tell people all the time, I said, look, get over yourself. Like if you went to engineering school, you didn't know much about engineering until you got there. And then you learned, you built up a foundation of knowledge. And now, man, you're creating stuff, you're doing stuff. It's awesome. When you sat down at the piano, you didn't even know the notes. And now you stuck with it. You've learned some really good technique. And the next thing you know, man, you're writing your own music. Awesome. So when it comes to spiritual life, let's teach people how to read their Bible. Let's teach them how to pray. Let's teach them what a stewardship of life really is all about. Let's talk to them about, this power that God gives us in his Spirit. Why don't we do that? Like, if we could just take some of these things, that will help people, I think, to become more and more, on the side of being discipled. They're going to start growing.
It's funny you say that, because we've talked to Gordon MacDonald a couple of times, and he talks about this in his book, Going Deep. He said the first thing I have to do is teach people to read their Bible.
Yeah.
Not meaning, hey, open your Bible and read it, but how to read it. And I reflected on it. And I think back to my own journey. And so I would read it as a new Christian, and there'd be stuff I didn't understand. And I just skip over, I just read it, but I wouldn't understand stuff. I just keep going. And then over the years, I think what happened is I don't think about that stuff anymore, because I've read it a bunch of times, and I don't actually sit and think about what does it actually mean.
Yeah.
And there's something, I think you need to read the Bible. When I taught a Bible study for years, you need commentaries, right?
Yeah.
You need to stop at those things you don't understand and spend a little time on them.
Yeah, because sometimes, like, I find, even as a preacher, like, I'm sitting now with the young guys now that are, the campus pastors. I want to teach them how do you really get at the nuggets that the Bible has? Because if you just allow a phrase in the Bible to just capture your creativity, and then next thing you know, you're off to the races, you could be making God say things that he never really said.
Yes.
Right. So by looking at these texts and beginning to open them up for people, I think that's the greatest gift that you can give to them.
And when it's done right, I've always said, if your Bible study is boring, right, you got to work hard to make the Bible boring.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember back in the day, man. There were it doesn't matter, but he was one of the Old Testament, Walt Kaiser, and a bunch of guys like that. They would always tell you, like, if you're making the Bible boring, it's because you're not doing it right.
Yeah. You either have to work hard to make it boring, or you need to not work at it.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Because I'm sure your sermon prep is not 20 minutes before you walk up on stage. There's prayer, and there's study, and there's commentaries, and there's books, and there's immersing yourself in Scripture. It takes real work.
Yeah, yeah. And
fascinating.
Yeah, and I went. I did my doctorate with Haddon Robinson. Mm-hmm. And maybe some who are listening to this broadcast, they could really appreciate Haddon's ministry. He was a great preacher. But what I really appreciated about Haddon more than his preaching style was the fact that Haddon would not turn a passage loose until he got every juice out of the text. Yeah. Every bit of juice. Like he didn't use a passage like people use tea bags in hot water. They just dump it in there and then they take it out. Like, now he would let it steep until you really understood what this passage was about, and he would ask you 1,001 questions to make that happen. Yeah. And then you'd realize, oh, okay, I get this now. Like, yeah. So he gave me some practical tools that I sit there, and unless I sit there in my sermon prepping with the guys now, I'm like, okay, guys, what's the big idea of this text? Mm-hmm. Before you start going off on some other thing, let's talk about what this text means. Yeah. Because you're going to start giving all kinds of applications, and you're going to be saying things that God just never said.
Yeah. Yeah. Or didn't say there anyway.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And that would be like the real heresy is saying good things from the wrong place.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it teaches people that it doesn't matter what it really says.
Yeah.
Right. We teach them bad discipline in that.
Well, you teach them to read their Bibles like they read a fortune cookie.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's really nice today. Oh, that must be for me.
Yeah. Right. And so, Bruce, I hear you saying a couple of different things in terms of your role as a pastor when it comes to disciple making. I'm hearing a kind of tone from the top, if you will, about messaging to people about the significance of this, what they need to be thinking about, doing, acting on. But I also hear something that is at a more hands-on level with your campus pastors, with individuals on your church. I know there's thousands of people in your church, so you can't possibly disciple each one, but you're building a personal relationship with them in small groups and individually.
I'm trying to make it very clear what their next step could be. Mm-hmm. Because not every
know me to do that, and you need to have a relationship with me, and that takes time.
Yeah. And like the relationship thing is a very interesting one in terms of the current environment in which we're living, right? Because so much stuff now. Look at you and me. We're on StreamYard. We're you're in your home. I'm in mine. We're talking, right? We have no idea who's going to be receiving this message. What it's going to do for people to trigger their own creativity to go out there and make disciples. That's our hope, right?
Yeah.
But I don't have any relationship with any of these. Like hopefully, some of my friends they'll call and they'll make fun of me, saying whatever. But what I have found in this day and age right now, especially with the proclivity of these platforms, what I am trying to do is make this available to people, and by doing that, making it available is not just information.
Yeah.
I'm making myself available as best I can.
Yeah.
And people will hear it. It's just like on a Sunday, you're preaching to the people that are there. I'm probably preaching to more people online than are in the room. I have no idea what's going on in their life, but that's the Spirit's job. Yeah. I'm telling them true things. I'm trying to live. And for the few that want to come and talk about it, I'll make time. Yeah. And I think if you teach that to other people and they do that, next thing you know, man, you built an army, man. People are going out there and doing it.
I think your family analogy, as we start to wrap up, your family analogy is a really significant one, because there's so much from it that plays in that disciple thing. And so what I just heard you say is so that people would do it, which there's an implicit statement there, or assumption that it's your job to make disciples. It's not your pastor's job. It is, but it's not only your pastor's job. And it's not only some ministry's job. Every one of us are given that command of go and make disciples. So if we're not doing that, we're missing something. But then your family analogy plays in that well, because that implies a relationship. It implies long-term. It implies tailoring it to each individual, because we're all wired up differently. It implies love and commitment and sacrifice. And so when I hear you say that, I'm like, okay, so who are the 2, 3, 1, anybody in my life where I'm spending that amount of effort with them, that we would say, hey, I'm actually discipling that person.
Yeah. And giving people, a lot of times the lack of confidence that we have to talk about spiritual things is because we haven't settled some of those questions in our hearts yet. Get somebody to, they go out and they buy a new Tesla, right? They're all of a sudden the spokesperson for electric cars, man. They're going to tell you everything about this Tesla. They're going to tell you about its screen. Look how big this display is. This car runs, and man, they become the advocate for Tesla because it struck a note with them, right? Like they're excited about it. Well, if you're not talking about Jesus this way, because maybe you're not really fully cognizant of all that's behind this. And I get it. Sometimes it can be a little confusing. So I'll help you. I'm going to put the cookies on the shelf, but you gotta take the cookies. Mm-hmm. And that's the hard part. Like, that's why discipleship is such it's like a 24/7. Yeah. You could do all your part, but people got to do their part.
Like parenting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And I want to draw one more attribute out of that, because it also speaks to this fact that I need to be in relationship with someone enough that I can do this. It also involves reprimand. Just like with your children, it involves reprimand. Bruce, we need to have enough relationship where you can say to me, hey, Charles, when you said this, that didn't reflect the love of Jesus at all. There's something wrong here. Yeah. And know that that's not going to break the relationship, because we love each other. Yeah,
well, you have those kinds of people in your life, and those are the greatest gifts that you can give to yourself. I mean, I think about that with my wife. Like, I call my wife like a velvet hammer. Like she is really a sweet person, but she's not afraid to speak into my life. And
Mm.
good thing, because she has toned me down and refined me in areas that without her I probably never would have done before.
Yeah. So many pastors' wives play that role in a really important way. And
Yeah.
so Bruce, thanks so much for being with us today. Thanks for letting us learn from your experience and your study and just glean some of that knowledge. This is a big area, right?
Yeah.
Because when we're actually living like disciples, where we're looking more and more like Jesus, loving people, suddenly people care what we have to say about Jesus in a way they don't when we're not doing those things.
Yeah.
And that transforms lives in the world, and that's really exciting. So thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you for the invite. This is awesome. Appreciate what you're doing as well.
Thanks so much. Thank you. And I'd like to also thank our producer, Jessica Mangano. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Luis Palau Association, who's dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide. If you like this, please like, share, follow us. You can find out more about it on visionnewengland.org. We'll be taking Thanksgiving off. Happy Thanksgiving. Can't believe that's next week. But we'll be back December 2nd with Bjorn Anderson. Bjorn is the Northeast Director of Young Life, and we'll be talking about how Young Life makes disciples who do justice and share Jesus. Thanks again for being with us, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you.